Well, good afternoon, and welcome to Copperfield's Books virtual event with Martin Puchner. I'm Jamie. I'm the Director of Events at Copperfield, and I'll also be your host today. So a couple things to note before we get started. The format today is between 35 to 40 minutes of speaking, and then we will open up a live Q&A. For any questions or comments that you have today, go ahead and submit them under the Q&A icon, which is right in the bottom middle of your screen. And you can do that at any time during the conversation. Additionally, we love Martin here, and this is our second event together, so we wanted to offer a 10% discount. Your support of independent bookstores worldwide means everything to us, so we wanted to give you a small token of appreciation. So now I'm thrilled to introduce today's author. Martin Puchner, the Byron and Anita Veen Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Harvard University, is a prize-winning author, educator, public speaker, and institution builder in the arts and humanities. He is a member of the European Academy and has received numerous awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Coleman Fellowship, the Berlin Prize, and the Massachusetts Book Award. He is with us from London tonight, and we're here to celebrate his latest title, Culture, the Story of Us, From Cave Art to K-Pop. Thanks for being with us, Martin. I'm so excited to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for having me. I love Copperfield's book. If you think about buying the book, please buy it from Copperfield's if you're in the US. And we dropped a link to the UK edition, bookshop edition as well. I wrote this book during COVID, in part to keep myself from doom scrolling, but also in the context of a heated debate about culture. When you Google the term culture, you're likely to turn up phrases like cultural appropriation, culture wars, cancel culture, terms and phrases that show just how much we fight about culture. And that's maybe not a bad thing, because at least it shows that people care about culture, care enough to fight about it. But I did feel like in this heated moment, as we're all in lockdown, and in many ways it continues, I realized that in order to sort of orient myself in this debate, or in these many debates and struggles, that I really didn't have a great idea of what culture really was and how it works. And so I decided to take a step back and try to answer that question. And so that's what I tried to do in this book. And I'm going to show you some slides to illustrate my points. And I want to sort of structure the presentation today around 5 sort of takeaway points, and illustrate each with a couple of examples drawn from the book. And so the first takeaway point is that culture is not natural, or that cultural transmission is not natural. And by that, I simply mean that in biological transmission, we automatically transmit our DNA to the next generation. That's how biological evolution works. Cultural evolution works very differently. We don't pass it on to the next generation automatically, which is why we have to devise memory devices and institutions that allow us to pass cultural knowledge, cultural insight onto the next generation. And so I want to start this presentation, I start the book with one of the earliest such memory devices, namely prehistoric caves. And the example I want to give is in today's southern France, the Chauvet Cave. Here you see the Ardèche River that created this pretty impressive large system of caves. Now, I should immediately mention that humans were not the first inhabitants of these caves. Originally, the Chauvet Cave was inhabited by bears and other animals from the era, and we know this because they left these imprints in the clay-coated floor of these caves. And so they were the first inhabitants. It was only after they left, and the bears would go there for hibernation. It was only after they left that humans started to use these caves as well. And these were, of course, hunters and gatherers, adept at reading tracks and traces. So they would have been even clearer than we are about exactly who these previous inhabitants of the caves were, because they would be able to tell them from these imprints and markings that these animals had accidentally left on the clay floors and the clay, sometimes the clay walls. And it was maybe inspired by these accidental markings that the humans started to decorate these caves as well. Sometimes with very simple devices, like here, a stick is used to draw the outlines of an animal. Again, using a thin layer of clay on these walls, but also more elaborate painting techniques here, a painting of a cave bear, precisely the kind of species that had inhabited these caves earlier. And so humans started to do this work on the caves and really decorated them in an increasingly elaborate manner. Now, what I want to emphasize is that this work on the Chauvet cave was took place over an incredibly long period of time. It started about 35,000 years ago and continued for about 5,000 years, generation after generation. As many as 200 successive generations of artists went into the caves and completed this work or pursued this work of decorating them. And it's important also to mention that humans never used these caves for shelter. They didn't live there. They only went for this particular purpose of turning these caves into a kind of total work of art and to conduct certain rituals in them. It's clear that the paintings were only part of the use of these caves. In one corner is a kind of altar piece with a skull on top of it, indicating that there were sort of performances or rituals enacted there. And there's also indication, mostly from other caves, that some of the more abstract markings and symbols that can also be found in these caves were used to mark particular positions for singers and musicians to achieve unusual echo effect. So it's clear that when we look at these cave paintings, that they are only part of a kind of multi-art environment that was created there. And I say that these humans went there for this particular purpose of marking, of turning these caves into a kind of multidimensional artwork. And I think of this not as a kind of know-how, the knowledge that was transmitted in these caves, not a kind of technical knowledge, what we call know-how of using tools or hunting techniques or how to make fire. But I think of the purpose of these caves as know why, a kind of meaning-making activities, an attempt to define for them how they saw themselves in relation to the environment, in relation to the other animals that existed, and in a more perhaps abstract way in the universe at large. So this is what for me culture became, the know why, a continuous attempt over 5,000 years to define what it means to be human and inhabitant of the earth. So I emphasize the 5,000 years, the continual work, showing a clear sense of collective enterprise here, but there are also individual signatures and even individual handprints. So with AI, we can actually identify individual artists in some cases. So clearly a combination of individual expression and a sense of collective multi-generational work. An example, in other words, that these caves were one of those storage devices that through which humans pass down or create a kind of continuity from one generation to the next, passing down cultural knowledge that isn't passed down naturally the way our DNA is. So that's the first takeaway point, that the evolution of culture is not natural, that we need these storage devices and institutions. We need humans to teach the next generation how to pursue these paintings, to care about them. And we need devices such, in this case, the cave itself, to serve as a storage device. This work continued, as I said, for about 5,000 years, but then it was rudely interrupted by a landslide that closed off the entrance to the cave. There was no one in the cave, since, as I mentioned, no one lived there. But it meant that the work, the multi-generational work, was suddenly interrupted. And the cave became almost like a kind of a capsule, a time capsule. But then a few thousand years later, probably another landslide or an earthquake opened up a side entrance to the cave. And now something interesting happened. Namely, a second group of humans entered these caves for the first time. Remember that several thousand years had passed since the last artist had entered these caves. So it's safe to assume that these humans were very different. Maybe they spoke a different language. Maybe they had very different meaning-making practices and art practices from the work that had gone so long before. So the second group of humans must have been puzzled by the work that this completely different civilization that was separated from them by many thousand years had wrought on these caves. And they probably tried to interpret what had gone on before, tried to make sense of these remnants from the distant past. And they didn't just try to interpret it, they most likely continued it in their own style. And that second group of humans brings me to my second takeaway point, namely that when it comes to culture, in an important sense, we are all latecomers. That is, we are all similar to that second group of humans who entered the Chauvet cave, namely that we are constantly confronted with kind of dimly understood artworks from the distant past that were interrupted, that there's usually an interruption in this continual transmission. And it's across these gaps of interruptions that we try to interpret what has come on before. And these interruptions just mean that the storage media that we create and the institutions through which we try to transmit cultural knowledge to the next generation are always prone to failure. And sometimes this failure is due to an external event, like the landslide that closed off the entrance to the cave. And sometimes they can be simply because cultures change priorities and find it no longer worth preserving certain cultural traditions, because preserving any cultural tradition always requires a lot of investment. It's expensive. So there's always a filter that goes on, filtering that happens, sometimes through willful destruction. But however this interruption happens, it means that we are separated from what happened before, and that we are trying to somehow have to understand these remnants of the past the way the second group of humans did when they, for the first time, saw these cave paintings that had been painted before. So latecomers, we are all latecomers, and I emphasize this in part because I feel like our culture tends to favor firsts, originality. I think it's a mode of thinking that is mostly driven by a sense of technological progress, where we are constantly improving in some sense, the way the iPhone 14 is better than the iPhone 6. But when it comes to culture, I think that kind of thinking is often misplaced. And yet it often sort of seeps in, I think, from a sense of technological progress to culture. So that even when we talk about cultural history, there's often an immense pride and struggle over, which culture was the first to paint with central perspective, or which culture invented writing, or which culture invented print. And as if there's a particular advantage to using these technologies or some prize for being first. But in culture, I think that sense is almost always misplaced, because, as I said, we are all latecomers. And what matters is not so much who is first, but what we latecomers do with the cultural forms that we encounter from the distant past. So that's my second takeaway point, that we are all latecomers. And I want to illustrate it with just one more example I like a lot, because since we are latecomers, the question is, what kind of attitude do we have with respect to a past that's different, that's obscure, that puzzles us, and that requires us to come up with some kind of response to it. So the person I want to introduce to you here is King Ashoka, an Indian king, probably the most important Indian king, who consolidated an empire based in northern India, but comprising quite a bit of the subcontinent. He's an important figure in Buddhism because at some point, while being a king, he started to embrace important insights and beliefs of Buddhism and started to formulate a very new and different kind of idea of what it means to be a king informed by Buddhism. He renounced violence. He urged his underlings to no longer slaughter animals, and urged them to adopt other aspects of Buddhism. And he urged them through edicts that he had inscribed in stones all across his realm. But not content with this form of proselytizing, if you want to call it that, he started to erect these very large stone pillars, like one that you see here, in which he inscribed these pillars with a very moving, very personal account of what it means to be a Buddhist king and what it means to live in accordance with Buddhism. Now, in inscribing these pillars, he wanted to speak to his people, and of course he knew that most of them wouldn't be able to read, so he had people read these inscriptions out loud on special occasions. But he also imagined that he was speaking to the future. So he was using yet another storage technique, in this case, not the walls of a cave, although there are fantastic Buddhist caves in India, many, many. So Buddhists knew that caves were a great storage technique and place for institutions. But in this case, writing the Brahmi script in stone. And he was very confident that with this storage technology, he would be able to speak to the future. And this went rather well for a while, but after several hundred years, the Brahmi script that he mostly used fell out of use, and his edicts became illegible. But the pillars remained. And they called attention to themselves And while no one was able to read them, there were oral stories that started to circulate around these pillars and the inscriptions and what they might mean. Now, you fast forward hundreds and hundreds of years to a Muslim ruler of northern India, Firoz Shah Tughlaq, who liked to go on hunting expeditions. And in one of these hunting expeditions, he encountered this large pillar. And he asked what it meant, and no one was able to tell him what the inscription meant. So it's clear that it came from the distant past, from a period, a pre-Islamic period, from a much earlier a dynasty than what he was himself part of. And now the question is, so he's a typical latecomer. There's an interruption, no more knowledge of the Brahmi script. That institution had been interrupted by changes in the culture, not a landslide in this case. But now the question was, what should Firoz Shah Tughlaq do with this pillar? Should he tear it down to show who was master of these lands now? Should he have it destroyed because it came from the pre-Islamic past and represented a different value system from the one that his kingship was based on? Interestingly, Firoz Shah Tughlaq did none of these things. On the contrary, he had this pillar, through huge effort, transported all the way to Delhi, where he had built the center of his realm, and had it erected within his palace, almost like a reminder that there was this earlier time, this earlier civilization, this earlier period with its different values, even though he didn't know what they were, and incorporated that difference into his idea of kingship. So a latecomer who encounters a remnant, dimly understood or not understood at all, but rather than destroying that or dismissing that, he decided to incorporate that into his own idea of what it meant to be a ruler in Delhi. So a typical example, but a great example, I think, of a latecomer and the kinds of decisions latecomers can make. So 2 takeaway points so far: that culture is not natural, that it requires these institutions and storage devices to be transmitted to the next generation. The fact that these institutions are prone to failure, leading to interruptions, which puts us all in the position of latecomers. The third takeaway point I want to present has to do with cultural borrowing, namely that cultures thrive when they borrow from others and survive when they encourage being borrowed by others. Again, it's sort of a basic point, but I make it before a contemporary debate around cultural appropriation. And I should say immediately that I agree with a lot of the values that people who worry about cultural appropriation, people who say we should be very careful not to appropriate from other cultures. I agree with many of the values, which I take to be avoiding superficial or disrespectful uses of other cultures, or purely sort of profiteering uses of other cultures. I'm completely against that, I suppose, obviously, but it bears saying. But I do think that sometimes in the discussion about cultural appropriation, we forget just that you can look at any culture, and then if you look closer, you realize that it is made from fragments of other cultures, and that's not a bad thing, that's a good thing, and that the more cultures borrow, the more open they are to borrowing and to being borrowed, they tend to thrive. The example I want to give is actually another example of the interruption that I spoke about earlier. So this is an image of Pompeii, which, as you all know, was destroyed by a volcano in AD 79, much the way in which the entrance to the Chevet Cave was shut off by a natural disaster through the landslide. And like the Chevet Cave, you can see in this case of Pompeii that destruction and preservation often go hand in hand. That was one of the, for me, unexpected insights from this project. Again and again, I found that destruction and preservation went hand in hand, that some form of destruction was sometimes needed to create these time capsules that allowed the past to pass to the present. It looks like a paradox, but it isn't, if you remember that probably the most destructive thing when it comes to preserving a particular moment in cultural history is continual use by humans. If humans had continued to live in Pompeii, that they would have used probably all the stones or most of the stones of the buildings and built new buildings and painted over the paintings and so on and so forth, and it would have changed gradually. Just as if the Chevet Caves had been continually accessible, probably all the paintings would have been painted over. After the second group of humans had entered and continued the work, the entrance had closed again for probably close to 30,000 years until the Chevet Cave was rediscovered in the late 20th century. So a time capsule through a destruction that kept humans out, and the same here with Pompeii. But what I'm mostly interested in, sort of what this time capsule, this snapshot of life in a Etruscan Roman town shows us about cultural borrowing. Now, the most well-known story about Roman cultural borrowing is, as you all know, that Rome was heavily influenced by Greece. Now, the way this story is usually told, I think, is misleading. The way the story is often told is if culture were sort of a relay race, and Greece has the baton and sort of passes the baton of culture onto Rome, and then Rome takes it and runs with it and somehow passes it on to, I don't know, Christian Europe. And then Christian Europe somehow takes it and passes it on to the United States. So that's sort of the Greece influences Rome, influences Christian Europe, influences the US kind of story. But I think actually what happens is much more interesting. It goes back a little bit to what I said about latecomers, because the use of Greece was not a matter of somehow the Greeks passing the baton. It was rather Romans deciding for their own reasons to borrow from Greece. Especially surprising since they had just defeated Greece in battle. And while there were some some Greek settlements in Rome, Rome had its own culture, and Pompeii had its own Etruscan language and culture. And you would imagine that now Rome and Tuscany might impose their own culture onto this defeated foe Greece. The opposite happened. And I started to think of this as a kind of strategic grafting, where Rome grafts elements of Greece, which is quite far away and quite different from Rome, grafts these elements onto its own tradition for no necessity. We tend to think of cultures imposing, in a case of war, of colonization, of one culture imposing its own culture through military or economic power. In this case, the opposite happens in an interesting way. A victor deciding to import or graft a whole cultural package onto its own tradition. But another thing is interesting about the snapshot, namely that's provided by the volcano of Pompeii, namely that Rome didn't just borrow from Greece, but from many other cultures as well, including Egypt, and also, which is much less known, South Asia. So there's a statuette, a small statue from South Asia that was preserved by the volcano. I'm sure it would have gotten lost if there had not been the volcanic eruption, if the time capsule Pompeii had not been created. And it's interesting to think about what this South Asian statue of a kind of South Asian goddess represented for the owner was likely a woman, because it was part of a kind of mirror from a woman's quarter in a Pompeian villa. Most likely her owner would have probably seen her as a version of the Roman goddess Venus, who herself was an adaptation of the Greek, or a graft from the Greek goddess Aphrodite. And that can prove it, but it's likely. And so that shows that often these kind of cultural borrowings are, are rife with misunderstandings and projections, but that's almost inevitably the case. But it just shows how much Rome was willing to borrow, even from faraway places. And Rome actually, it also shows a lively long-distance trade between the Roman Empire and South Asia. In fact, so much so that there was actually a trade imbalance, and because Rome had apparently relatively little to trade in return, so they had to spend hard currency to acquire art objects like this South Asian statuette in Rome. So a great example of borrowing, of wide-scale borrowing, in this case, more strategic borrowing from South Asia, broader borrowing from Greece, but also from Egypt. The other example of a kind of cultural grafting I want to give you has to do with China. And because I started to think about who are these agents of the borrowing. Sometimes I follow in these chapters particular objects like this statuette from South Asia, but I sometimes also focus on the actual agents. Who does the borrowing? Who is responsible for this kind of cultural transfer? And an interesting example is the monk Xuanzang, member of the literati class, who embraces Buddhism as a pretty young man and decides to travel west to the birthplace of Buddhism, namely India. And he spent 16 years in India traveling and recording his experience in a journal. And then he returns home with statues, with knowledge about Buddhist practices in China, and with a ton of manuscripts that he then spends the rest of his life translating, and has a decisive influence on Buddhism in China. He undertook his travels just as an individual. In fact, he violated an imperial decree of travel through these sometimes war-torn regions between China and India, and was in fact afraid of being punished when he returned. But fortunately, a new emperor, Tang Emperor, had ascended the throne and actually rewarded him for his knowledge of foreign cultures. But so an individual who travels at great risk and becomes an important agent of cultural transmission. So all of this is under the headline of cultural borrowing. I want to move on to the fourth takeaway point. So we have, just to recap one more time, we have that culture is not natural, that it relies on these storage devices like caves or writing on pillars or carving statues in ivory, like the South Asian statuette, that these storage devices are prone to failure, or that knowledge of them can disappear, and that we are therefore latecomers who encounter remnants of the past and have to decide what to do with them, as Firoz Shah Tughlaq did when he encountered Ashoka's pillar. That cultures thrive on borrowing and often survive by borrowing. So Buddhism, as transmitted from India to China by travelers such as Xuanzang, is a good example. Because even though Buddhism first emerged in India, it actually declined in India and was fortunately transported to China by figures like Xuanzang, and where it continued to thrive in China until Chinese emperors turned against Buddhism in China. But fortunately, it had been transmitted to Japan by other travelers, part of an imperial mission, an official mission from Japanese emperors who decided to import, again, out of their own free will, much as Rome had done with Greece, many elements of Chinese culture to impose it, to graft it onto its own Japanese traditions so that Buddhism could thrive in Japan when it declined in China. So it's a story of continual borrowing from India to China to Japan, of transformation. Of course, these are all active and creative processes. And there are strategies of survival. Buddhism would not have become the kind of world religion it became if these kinds of cultural borrowing hadn't happened. And so the fourth takeaway point is sort of it's the flip side, I suppose, of this absolute centrality of cultural borrowing, namely that I came away with the belief that ultimately cultures can't be owned. And the primary example, or my favorite example in any case, is a lesser known text that I think should be much better known, the Kebra Nagast, the Ethiopian scribal text. And when I say cultures can't be owned, I know that I'm, in some sense, at variance with a language of cultural ownership that's very strong right now. And again, I want to acknowledge that I think in certain circumstances, especially when it comes to the restitution of cultural objects that were stolen or acquired under very dubious circumstances by mostly Western museums, that I'm all, and I understand that in this restitution debate, for example, having to do with Benin statues from Western Africa that can be found in American and British and German and French museums, that this restitution debates, people have mobilized a language of ownership quite successfully. So I think in the case of the restitution debate, I understand that it sometimes makes sense to speak of cultural ownerships, that groups own cultures in some way. But ultimately, more fundamentally, I think it's important to remember that cultures can't be owned because they're made of so many other fragments, because they always fuse, and because cultures just don't work like that. I think that's what I came away from this admittedly bird's eye view of culture and the steep view of culture, that if you want to restrict cultural circulation through this idea of ownership, it leaves everyone impoverished in the end. So in the case of the restitution debate, I think in some cases it makes sense to return objects, but the goal, I think the ultimate goal, can't be that everything just goes back to where it came from. I mean, that would empty almost all museums around the world. The goal has to be more circulation through better forms of borrowing, not an insistence on ownership. And so the Kebra Nagast, and this is, I'm almost at the end here, is a perfect example. So the Kebra Nagast is based on an episode in the Hebrew Bible where the Queen of Sheba comes to visit King Solomon in Jerusalem because she's heard that King Solomon is so wise, and she wants to check him out, and she cross-examines him and is fairly impressed, and then she goes back home. The Kebra Nagast takes this episode and says that, this is what happened, but something else happened, namely that she became pregnant and returned to Ethiopia, gave birth to a son of her and King Solomon's. The son grows up in Ethiopia. When he is of age, she sends him back to his father. King Solomon accepts him as his son, even wants him to stay and perhaps in the future rule in Jerusalem. But the son, after a while, wants to go home again to Aksum in Ethiopia. So King Solomon gathers a group of youths and sends them back with his son to Ethiopia. The night before they leave, they go and steal the Ark of the Covenant that contains the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments that Moses had written on Mount Sinai, taking dictations from God. So the holiest of holies of the Jewish people, they steal that and take it with them to Ethiopia, where it becomes the foundation, interesting, not of Ethiopian Jewish identity, but of Ethiopian Christianity. So I should say that the story of theft is, there's no reason to believe it actually happened. Although when when Jerusalem was sacked for the second time, there's no mention of the 10 Commandments. So somehow they must have gotten lost or disappeared. But in any case, what interests me here is this again, we have a sort of radical form of grafting, of Ethiopian Christians grafting themselves onto this story in the Hebrew Bible, and even imagining a kind of dynastic connection to it through the shared son of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon, and the theft, quote unquote, of this object. And the Kebra Nagas, this fantastically interesting scribal text written in Ge'ez, the scribal language, had an interesting afterlife in the 20th century, halfway around the world, when Jamaicans, looking for African cultural traditions through which to create their identity as Black Jamaicans, encountered this text and, in a sense, made it their own. And that's the beginning of the Rastafari movement, where this text plays an important role. So there are sort of two grafts or two movements here, one from Jerusalem to Aksum in Ethiopia, and then from Ethiopia in the 20th century to Kingston and Jamaica. So that's the fourth takeaway point, that cultures ultimately can't be owned. And the last one is maybe a kind of obvious one, and I don't want to dwell on it very long, is that we should have an attitude of humility with respect to the past, the way perhaps Firoz Shah Tughlaq was the best example today. In order to imagine that, I end with a project that some of you may know called Future Library, created by the Scottish artist Katie Patterson, who asks authors each year to write a story. The story will be kept locked up for 100 years, and in 100 years, it will be printed on paper made from the saplings that are growing in this wood above, in the forest above Oslo, where this project is taking place. So in a way, for my interest, a perfect, I think, bookend, because it engineers this interruption of which I stop. No one can read it now. No one alive today will read these works. It highlights the question of institution. Will we still care about these texts? How will we still know about printing? There's a printing manual that's part of this project in case the knowledge of printing no longer exists. But the biggest question it raises is, will people in the future still care about texts written by our civilization, or will they be judgmental? Will they look down on us? For example, because of what we have been doing with the environment, there's a big environmental angle here, and dismiss us out of hand. So any artist somehow has to imagine that the future will judge us not too harshly, even though it may have good reasons to. And I think the same is what we should do with the past. So 5 takeaway points. Culture is not natural. We are all latecomers. Cultures thrive when they borrow from others, and when they survive, when they let themselves be borrowed. That cultures can't be owned, and no one ultimately owns culture, and that we should cultivate an attitude of humility with respect to the past. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm hope very much that you'll have questions and that we can have some kind of debate about these topics.
Yes, let's get into it. That was so fascinating. Thank you so much, just to start off. And we do have quite a few questions, so can we just jump right in?
Please.
All right, so Sherry put in a question when you were talking about the bears and the cave drawings, and she wants to know, where did the bears go?
It's a good question. Why did they no longer frequent that particular cave? I don't know, actually. They may have moved on to a different cave. Maybe there was something that disturbed them. They stopped. They would go there primarily for hibernation. So maybe it was another environmental change. I don't think we actually know, but it is a good question. But humans would not sort of coexist with these huge cave bears. So they would only dare to enter once. At least this particular cave was no longer sought out by bears. But the bears remained as paintings. That's the fascinating thing.
Yes.
And through these imprints.
And I might butcher some of these questions, by the way. How was Firoz Shah Tughlaq able to transport this massive pillar to Delhi? Was it damaged or changed in transport?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I forget the numbers, but it was a huge undertaking. So they first dug through its foundation, then they very carefully, with dozens of ropes, lowered it onto its side, and then he really employed thousands of people. It was, of course, also a display of power, that he could command incredible resources. It was dragged on carts to a river, and then loaded onto boats, to barges on the river. So it was an incredible operation, and there is a contemporary account of it, which is why it might be an exaggeration, but it was a massive undertaking. Wow. And it shows how much he cared. But as I said, it was also an occasion to display his reverence for this past, but also the power at his command, I would say.
That was a good question, Elizabeth. Thank you. All right, so Rob has a question. Would you relate the mechanism that you describe whereby knowledge, memories, culture is transmitted from one generation to the next to the notion of inherited memory as described by Marianne Hirsch?
Interesting. I love Marianne Hirsch's work. She was a colleague of mine at Columbia. I taught for many years at Columbia, and her work has influenced my thinking very much, though primarily in a book called The Language of Thieves, where I talk about both family histories and the Holocaust, and where that notion, second generation survivors and second generation memory kind of plays a large role. So I have to say, I haven't, because in my mind, it's sort of associated with that kind of question I didn't use it in this book, but I think it's interesting because it does talk about a kind of memory mechanism, and I think inherited here means not biologically inherited, but it's a form of cultural inheritance having to do with survivor's guilt or guilt about the deeds done by one's predecessors or ancestors, fathers or grandfathers. It's certain attitudes and fears and anxieties that get passed down. But I guess I think the argument is not biologically, but culturally. So I think it's an interesting, and I think it talks to the, how should I put it, the sort of ephemeral inheritance, because these are not sort of deliberate memory projects that are used the way in which I paint a cave or inscribe a pillar so that a next generation can see it, but it's a much more diffuse and inadvertent form of inheritance. So just thinking out loud here, it just shows that because when it comes to culture, it's always a matter of one generation somehow shaping the next generation in all of its experience and passing things down through, sometimes through silence, through omissions, through maybe an object, a tattoo on an arm, or other small things. In the book The Language of Thieves, I describe how through an accident, I discovered a really hateful anti-Semitic treatise written by my grandfather that no one in the family knew about. And it got me onto this family history where this secret had been glimpsed and then buried again, and then had to be discovered in each generation in a certain way. That's when I started to think about that inherited memory. In any case, so I think to close this loop, it's one of the many forms in which cultural knowledge is passed from one generation to the next. And sometimes in this book, I emphasize the more deliberate forms, I suppose. But it's a great question, and it shows that there's also a lot of inadvertent or much more diffuse or that kind of inheritance that happens in the realm of culture as well. Really great question.
So interesting. Yeah, thanks for the question. We have a quick one here from Paul. Maybe it's not so quick, actually. Which culture invented writing?
So clearly you haven't been listening, because I told you it doesn't matter. No, I'm just kidding. And I plead guilty. I have spent a lot of time thinking about it. I wrote a book called The Written World. It's very much about this question. So the first full script was the cuneiform script. So in today's Iraq. And the first great text that was written text that was produced with this script was the Epic of Gilgamesh. And so this is a text that I have long been fascinated by and have written about in many ways. And I do consider it a sort of foundational text. And then there are other early writing cultures like Egypt and China, and it's actually not certain whether they invented writing on their own, or whether there was sort of an ideas transfer, because all of this happened on the same Eurasian landmass, whether the idea of writing somehow was transmitted to the scripts. The Egyptian hieroglyphics and Chinese signs are very different from each other. So it's possible that humans invented these scripts independently. But and this is something that I also talk about in this book, The Written World, that what fascinated me is that we know humans invented writing at least twice completely independently because of the great tradition of writing in the Americas prior to the Spanish conquest, namely the Mayans. And so the text, the Popol Vuh, is sort of the greatest text that emerges from this writing tradition, although there are also Aztec picture writing codices that survive. Most of these texts were deliberately destroyed by the Spanish, but some survive. And the Mayan tradition is the most elaborate and longest. It's by now 2,000 years old, but prior to the Spanish, it's the only completely, definitely independent writing tradition in the world. So it's almost like kind of a control experiment. What kind of influence did writing have on the society? What was the status of books and writing in Mayan scribal culture? So in other words, the first was Mesopotamia, today's Iraq, but there are other firsts, independent traditions, definitely the Mayans, maybe the Chinese. But there's still much to be excavated. I was actually this fall, I was able to go for the first time to Iraq for two weeks. And I visited some of the sites, including Uruk, where the Epic of Gilgamesh is set and where writing is said to have been invented. And it was fascinating to see. And these sites are still almost completely unexcavated, in part because of wars. We are now, today is almost the 20th anniversary of the American invasion of Iraq. So if only now are excavations slowly starting again in Iraq. So another interruption. So I have long been fascinated with this question: which culture invented writing first and the effects of it. And so when I emphasize in this book the importance of latecomers, I'm correcting my own, above all, my own fascination with firsts, and so I get it.
And don't worry, in our email tomorrow, we will definitely include your previous work so people can kind of brush up if they haven't had a chance yet. Okay, so Jacqueline has a question. Borrowing culture makes the borrower stronger, but how about the borrowee?
Well, so I think that when you have cultural contact, borrowing often goes in both directions, right? It's very rarely just one directional. So I think very often borrowers are also borrowees. So that's, I think, the first thing I would say. And the second is that, and I think the case of Buddhism is a good example, that being borrowed, so to speak, letting yourself be borrowed, or in the case of Xuanzang, of Indian Buddhists giving Xuanzang manuscripts and statues to take home to China. Again, if you want to put it so crassly, I don't think that's often the motivation, but it pans out that way, increases your chances of survival, increases your influence. Sometimes political scientists use the term of soft power. So I think I would say there's also often a lot you get out of being borrowed, so to speak. Now, of course, there's always a question of how this borrowing functions, how voluntary it is. It's true that cultural contact is not often rife with misunderstandings. It's also often rife with power imbalances and violence. So I'm not saying any form of cultural contact is great. And as I said, we have to devise better forms of borrowing, in part because I think it's so important. But so I think that it requires in each case to look at what happens. But in the long run, I think it's important to borrow, and it's often also important to let yourself be borrowed. Although, as I said, I think, we can all think of terrible exploitative moments where some, that's also part of cultural history. And, you can see that it happens. It's very hard to draw the line, I think. But I don't think we need to condone any form of cultural contact as always great. But I do think that it's important to not lose sight in worrying, when we worry and want to rightly stop some of the exploitative practices that definitely happen. I think it's not important not to lose sight that ultimately the goal is not to stop borrowing, but to have better forms of borrowing. That's how I would put it.
That's so fascinating. Okay, and we have a lot of questions here, so I'm just kind of jumping around. I'm sorry if I don't get to yours. Lucy is wondering, could you tell us in what language was the Kebra Nagast originally written? Is this language still alive or extinct? And will your book have a second volume?
That's funny that you should ask. I'll start with the second question first. It sort of will. I'm actually in the process. So it was published in the US by Norton, which is both, and I've worked a lot on the Norton Anthology of World Literature with Norton, which is both a textbook publisher and a trade book publisher. So this is the trade book, but I'm now expanding it. And in some sense, it might even grow by 100% into a sort of more textbook introduction to the arts and humanities. So I'm already adding new sections, and it's great because it's so hard to choose what to include and what not to include. So it's actually great to have a second round, a second go at it. Now the Kebra Nagast, in the form that it exists now, and it's actually included, parts of it are included in the Norton Anthology of World Literature. That's the context in which I first came across it. I had not heard of it before I started working on the anthology, and worked with lots of people who recommended texts and so on and so forth. So that was a real education for me. And ever since I came across it, I wanted to write about it, because I've found that it was not just that I not know about it, very few people outside a small group of experts and Rastafaris know about this text. But so it's written in the scribal language of Ethiopia, which is Ge'ez. But there's actually a big debate about whether this text had previously been written in another language. So there is a speculation that it might have been translated into Ge'ez, and that it had been written in Syriac, or maybe even also Arabic. So there's a chapter in the book about the Baghdad House of Wisdom, which became a big center of cultural translation, and they translated text from India, Persia, Greece. So Arabic being an important language that mediates between different cultures and transmitted knowledge from different cultures. So it's possible that so there's a big debate about the original language of this text, but the final language, or the important language, is the Ethiopian scribal language, Ge'ez.
Thanks for that question. We have so many people thanking you, by the way. Fascinating talk. Thank you. I'll be adding the books to my shelves. Thanks so much. So, lots of
well, that's very
happy
kind.
people. Yeah. So we have another question. Thank you so much for the lecture and such a great event. I have a question. In a very globalized and technological century, how should the cultures be viewed? Should we preserve them? And if yes, how?
I think preservation is hugely important. In part, once you take this bird's eye view, you just become aware of how little survives, and just how immense, because cultural storage is so costly, and because it's so prone to failure, so little survives, such small fragments, like that one statue, that one South Asian statue from Pompeii. And that's only because the volcano created this time capsule. By the end of the project, I started to get obsessed with time capsules, different forms of time capsules. And I wrote about them a little bit in the epilogue. And just how much disappears, how little gets preserved, and often through accidents, like when the Chauvet Cave entrance, was sealed off, or when the volcano buries Pompeii under ash, or the first chapter in the book is about Queen Nefertiti, this Egyptian queen, fascinating story, whose work gets mostly preserved because she founded a new city, and then that city was abandoned, and her entire reign and realm literally erased from subsequent Egyptian history, which was terrible. It erased it, but it also preserved it because it could be recovered. So just how much gets lost, and how important it is to be in conversation with our cultural past. I think of this book sort of as an account of humans as a kind of culture producing species, if you will, and that to preserve as much of that as possible. But the other takeaway point with respect to preservation is that we must care, that whatever we don't use, we lose in some sense, because we have other priorities, we don't pay attention, it falls by the wayside. And this is true even in the electronic world. Now, it's interesting that at this moment, storage, which through most of human history was very expensive, scribes who were transcribing one book, had to make incredible hard decisions, which books to preserve through transcription. And only now is the cost of at least electronic storage going towards zero. So in some sense, you can say we live for the first time in a kind of storage rich, or in a storage world of plenty. But there are also problems with electronic storage, the obsolescence of electronic media. I worked for 10 years for the European Research Council, where we funded a lot of digitization projects of cultural artifacts that were about to disappear. And some of these databases are already inaccessible because of the changing formats. And so the obsolescence of electronic media is a huge problem, and people are now more aware of it. So just because we save it somewhere in the cloud doesn't mean that it's necessarily accessible, and that we can somehow be done with it in a certain way. So I think the other thing that's important is, in some sense, education. In other words, instilling in the next generation a sense that this is important stuff that's worth having. And if no one thinks it's worth having, then I think it will disappear. So that's what I think. So it's not just sort of a technical problem, though the technological challenges and possibilities are always interesting to observe and to take seriously. But it's ultimately not so much about technology. I think it's more about education.
This has been such a compelling and enjoyable conversation. I thank you so much again for being here. And sorry to everyone whose questions I didn't get, but we do have quite a few people who said they would come for the next for your next volume.
Okay. Okay. It will take me a little while.
Oh yeah, is it kind of, are you working on it already, or is there anything?
I am working on it already, yeah.
Okay, well, we'll just wait.
Yes.
For all of you wondering, yes, this was being recorded. I will send everyone an email tomorrow. It'll have a link to this recording. It'll have discount codes. It'll have UK and US links, as well as previous titles by Martin. So don't worry. If you just watched, I've got you covered. Thank you, Martin. I really appreciate it.
And thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Copperfield's books. And, we've been talking about institutions of storage and teaching the next generation and preserving culture. I think bookstores, independent bookstores, are an incredibly important part of that infrastructure. So we all should support them.
Thank you. All right. You have a great evening.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye, and bye, everyone. And thanks very much for your comments and questions and being part of this.
Good night.